Welcome to Gloria Day. In this episode of Great Talks at Gloria Day, we are having our local author, Michael Schreiber, back to give us part 2 of Perils of the Sea. His first episode was fascinating and is available on our website along with Michael's bio. So if you didn't catch the first one, I highly recommend you log in and watch that video first, and then this one will carry on from that. I do want to remind you that after our presentation of the video, we will have a live Q&A on the webinar with Michael, and you'll be able to send in some questions, and we're looking forward to that chat. It's always fascinating to learn more in these one-on-one interviews. If you enjoy what we're doing here at Gloria Day, please hit the donate button and make a donation to support our preservation efforts. It is only possible with all of our community help. So thank you so much.
A fair number of stones in our courtyard here at Gloria Day memorialize people who were lost at sea. Now, 200 years later, it's usually difficult to research exactly what happened to such people, since there's no official burial or city death records to refer to. So the researcher has to try to develop the story out of materials such as shipping reports and newspapers of the period, crew lists that might be submitted to the Philadelphia Port authorities, and perhaps additional letters or documents that are stored away in archives. The gravestones here at Gloria Day, for example, tell us of Captain James and Josephine Stewart, husband and wife, who lost their lives together at sea in September 1856. James Stewart was the youngest son of James Sr. and Sarah Stewart, the caretakers of Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. And our research on the family appears in an article in the Historic Gloria Day website. Josephine was born in New York, and she was 19 when she married, and she was 25 years old when she died. So I tried to investigate when the fatal event took place, but it took days of searching before just a few clues began to pop up. And I found mention of a Captain James Stewart living in New Orleans in 1855, and a man of the same name who commanded a schooner, the Ellen, between Baltimore, Richmond, New Orleans, and Havana in 1855 and 1856. Records of the ship departures in the newspapers mention that the schooner Ellen left New Orleans on August 8, 1856, bound for Matanzas, Cuba, and carrying a cargo of lard, coal, and empty barrels. And with Captain Stewart were his wife, his children, and his niece, along with a crew of 15. And when the Ellen left New Orleans, people there were still unaware that a tremendous hurricane had been mounting force in the Gulf and heading quickly for Louisiana. But the Ellen sailed straight into it. At around 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, August the 10th, the storm crashed into Last Island. That's a barrier island that is on the Louisiana coast, and today it's pretty much underwater. In 1856, a village stood on the island, and this was a beach resort for vacationers, including many from New Orleans high society, along with their slaves. And on this occasion, the owner of the Ocean House Hotel had brought in a cotillion band from New Orleans, and the guests danced and they gambled and they partied into the night. This was Saturday night. And we can imagine that many of them slept late that Sunday and were surprised at breakfast time to see that a squall seemed to be brewing off the coast. And the squall quickly became a gale. And then it was a raging hurricane, which lashed the island with 100-mile-an-hour winds. So at first, the winds whipped in from the bay side, that's from the north, and the people on the island moved towards the Gulf shore to escape the flooding water. And then the wind shifted, and towering waves battered the island from the Gulf itself. So by 4 p.m, water from the bay had met the surf coming in from the Gulf. And the low-lying island was virtually covered with water. The 2-story hotel collapsed, crushing entire families beneath its timbers. About 150 people sheltered in the ferry boat that had been grounded on the bay side of the island, while others tried to hold on to floating driftwood to save their lives. A few held on to the poles of a carousel, and a few tried to crawl their way into a lighthouse that was still standing. The hurricane battered the area at full strength for an entire day and night, and high winds and huge waves and floating debris demolished every single one of the island's buildings. And after the storm had moved inland, practically every sign of the village had been erased. Even the foundations of buildings were covered with yards of sand. And at least 198 people were killed on the island, they say. Probably many more if you count the slaves of many of the rich people there. Plus dozens more in ships that foundered in the Gulf and in the bay. 10 days later, a boat discovered the remains of the schooner Ellen sticking out of the sand of Last Island. Part of her stern was visible, but all hands, plus Captain James Stewart, Josephine Stewart, and their family were presumed lost. So today they are memorialized on a monument in Gloria Day churchyard. As I've tried to research the stories of some of the other people who are commemorated in the churchyard as being lost at sea, the exact circumstances of their demise has not yet become completely clear. I say not yet. On the website of Historic Gloria Day, you can read about one sea captain that our board member Amy Grant and I looked into, and that is Peter Cruz. Cruz was born in Sweden in 1785, and he ran away to sea, joining the Swedish Navy. He came to the United States in 1815, and he sought out the pastor of this church, the Reverend Nicholas Colleen, who was his cousin. And so soon afterwards, he married Catherine Simpson, who was 17 at the time, the daughter of a shipbuilder. And her brother operated a dry dock for ship repairs just steps from where I am standing now, right out this window here at the foot of Christian Street. Catherine died of dysentery, it might have been cholera, in 1830. The inscription on her gravestone, which unfortunately now has worn away, used to mention her man, that was Peter Cruz. And we found newspaper articles mentioning the death of Peter Cruz in Honduras just 2 years later, in 1832. So Amy and I puzzled about what might have happened to him. And after a while, I discovered reports by sea captains, including reports by Peter Cruz himself, which had been recorded in newspapers of the era, and they noted that Central America was in the throes of a series of revolutions and armed coups. And finally, I found a relatively obscure article in a newspaper of 1832, which recorded the situation in Amoa, Honduras, in which a conservative general had rebelled and gathered his supporters into a powerful castle, fortress on a hill, from which they were shelling the town below. And at one point, according to the newspapers, a cannonball breached the wall of the U.S. consulate, killing the consular official, a man named A.P. Hosmer from upstate Pennsylvania. And according to the article, the supercargo of a U.S. vessel that was in port at the time, identified as Peter Cruiser, was visiting the consul at the time and was wounded by a cannon shot. Other articles of the period leave little doubt that the newspaper's Peter Cruiser was in fact Peter Cruz, a congregant of this church. It's not unlikely that Cruz later died from his wounds during the cannon bombardment, although should be pointed out that this region of Honduras had been devastated by twin epidemics of cholera and yellow fever, and many U.S. seamen were victims. So there's many more details of the circumstances surrounding Peter Cruz's life and his death and the revolutionary situation in Honduras at the time, and you can read about that on our website. Among the names on the gravestones of people who were lost at sea are two sea captains who disappeared while on voyages to the same region of Africa. One of them, Captain Henry Sharp, appears in the Philadelphia Directory of 1810 as a 24-year-old mate living in a back alley. And later, as a sea captain, he lived on South 2nd Street, making frequent voyages to the West Indies and to Africa. On one voyage, Sharp's mate and 4 crewmen died while their vessel was in the Rio Pongas, the heart of the slave trade in what is now the country of Ghana. But Sharp was not a slave trader. He returned to Philadelphia with a cargo of beeswax, ivory, palm oil, hides, camwood, and gold. And Sharp reported that the colony of relocated former American slaves in Liberia seemed to be thriving, but that slave ships were thick along the African coast. On his final voyage to Africa, Sharp left Philadelphia on the brig Mary on November 14th, 1835. On New Year's Day, according to later reports in the newspaper, the Mary was at the river Gambia and due to sail shortly for the river Nunez, where it was spotted in March 1836. There was no more word about the Mary until May the 11th, when she returned to Philadelphia, but without Sharp, and under command of the mate, a man named Bancroft. The mate gave the news that Captain Sharp had died in Africa at just about the time of his 50th birthday. Still, at this point, I'm not certain exactly how he died. Another gravestone here at Gloria Day is for Captain Robert Ray, who died 3 years later at almost the same place where Henry Sharp lost his life. That is along the river Nunez. Now, I should digress for a moment to explain that Ray was not a parishioner at Gloria Dei. His gravestone was originally erected at Ronaldson's Cemetery at 9th and Bainbridge Streets. And when Ronaldson's was converted into a city playground in the year 1950, the bodies were moved and most of the stones were destroyed. But a handful of stones belonging to men who were thought to have been soldiers in the American Revolution were moved to this churchyard in order to memorialize them. So a couple of years ago, when Amy and I were beginning to research some of the men whose names were on those stones, we realized that the lives of some of them had been misinterpreted. Some of them were far too young to have fought in the Revolution, and Captain Robert Ray was one of these people, having been born in 1789, after the Revolution. But although he was not a revolutionary soldier or a parishioner at Gloria Dei, he was a close neighbor, having lived for a couple of years with his wife Jane in what's now Kenilworth Street, although on a section that's now been buried by the I-95 expressway. And so I think as a neighbor, it's appropriate that a monument to him stands here, although his body was never brought home. So how did Ray lose his life? Well, the answer in similar incidents, perhaps with Henry Sharp also, is often disease. Most crew members on trading ships from Europe and America had little resistance to tropical diseases like malaria. An 1873 US government handbook for shipmasters called The West Coast of Africa from Cape Spartel to Sierra Leone cautions its readers, quote, "The climate of the river Nunez is very unhealthy. It is rare for the crews of vessels which have been in the river any time to escape the dangerous fevers." But there were other tensions, other dangers, including problems with the local people on the African coast. In 1839, when Captain Ray made his last voyage on the bark Rosalba, the area around the River Nunez was in the midst of wars amongst the local tribes, which was interfering with the commercial European ship traffic. For example, a few weeks before the Rosalba arrived on the coast, a New York ship, the Transit, put into the River Nunez after suffering heavy damage in a hurricane. And newspapers later gave a report by a British naval officer, quote, that the ship Transit of New York, in passing down the River Nunez, had been boarded by people of one of the kings of the country and robbed of a considerable amount of property, and one man killed belonging to the ship before they surrendered. The reason the king gave the supercargo of the ship for robbing her was that they had sold powder, that's gunpowder, to his enemies up the river with whom he was at war, and which enabled them to invade his dominions and make slaves of his people. So, in fact, these conflicts with the native people possibly led to an unfortunate mistake at the beginning of March 1839, when the Rosalba arrived off the River Nunez to trade for palm oil and gold dust. So Captain Ray took the jolly boat to visit the shore, and supposedly a large grouping of native people gathered on the beach to receive him. And in the meantime, the mate who had remained aboard was watching the progress of Ray through his spyglass and couldn't tell whether the gathering on the beach was friendly or not. And moreover, he imagined that he saw their boat upset in the surf. So this apparently created some alarm in his mind, and this was reinforced when he saw that another boat had been dispatched from the shore to their vessel, bearing a white flag at the end of a pole. The mate, named Thomas Bevans, evidently thought the white flag was some sort of trick and that it was necessary to escape. So he raised his anchor and he ordered the Rosalba to sea. And in the meantime, Captain Ray was stranded on the shore, though he was perfectly unharmed. And he thought that his mate had just led a mutiny. And luckily there was a fleet of British ships in the region, which were on the hunt for slave traders. And Ray was able to enlist the help of the British Commodore, who delegated 4 naval vessels to chase the Rosalba. And ultimately they found her, and after all the misunderstandings were clarified, Ray took command once again. And he then, Ray, wrote a letter thanking the British ships for aiding him, which was reprinted in U.S. newspapers several months later. But that might have been the last letter that he wrote. Another letter by the mate, Thomas Bevans, informed people back home that Captain Ray had died on April the 2nd, 1839, and he was buried the next day, or cast into the sea the next day. The mate's letter is on file, and we've seen it, in the collection of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And it's within a large folder of correspondence, which are mainly on legal matters that followed Robert Ray's untimely death. I found the handwriting in the mate's letter extremely difficult to decipher. But I gathered at the start, he states that Captain Ray died, quote, after a short, and then I couldn't quite read the words, of 8 days. And the missing words seem to end with stress, such as in the word distress. So it seems likely to me that he was referring to a disease which lasted 8 days as the cause of Ray's demise, though he might have been possibly referring to an injury such as a bullet wound. Bevans then states that the Rosalba had seen a lot of trouble, and he said they were running out of food in his letter and unable to obtain any in the port. Quote, I give the men farina in substitute for bread. He added that the Rosalba had been unable to land its cargo. And another letter in the same file by an attorney makes the situation clearer. He wrote, quote, the mate said that a civil war was going on amongst certain of the natives, and he was very afraid to land the cargo as it might be subjected to the depredations incident to the unusual disorder which then existed in the country, end quote. So the legal matters detailed in the correspondence at the Historical Society had mainly to do with the efforts of Ray's widow, Jane, to sue the mate. It seems that Robert Ray had owned the Rosalba, which they claimed was valued at $5,000. But now, after its disastrous voyage, the Rosalba was up in New York in the hands of other people, while the mate was demanding extra wages for the time that he was master of the vessel. So Jane Ray needed to recover some money. And the case dragged on for at least 3 years. And I did, however, read in the Historical Society letters that in the meantime, a rich aunt of hers had died in northern England, and that there was a good chance that she would inherit a lot of money. So maybe things turned out all right for the widow in the end. So as for exactly what happened to Captain Ray, it doesn't seem to have been clear to anyone. His widow's chief attorney, that's John Cadwallader, even asked Thomas Buchanan, the governor of Liberia and the cousin of the future president, James Buchanan, to try to inquire about the circumstances. Cadwallader wrote about Ray's family having, quote, a painful feeling of uncertainty, which can only be relieved by some precise and authentic information of the time and circumstances of his death, and would be a matter of some consolation if some particulars as to his burial could be added to the information, end quote. So Buchanan wrote back that he would ask some of the British naval officers in the region if they knew anything. But the file at the Historical Society doesn't contain any more particulars, and Buchanan himself died soon afterwards. So for now, we have to leave the matter of how Captain Ray died still imprecise. Another sea captain who's commemorated on a stone at Gloria Day as being lost at sea is Charles Sandgren. His wife, Sarah Sandgren, died in May 1860 at the age of 72, having lived as a widow for 31 years. And when the inscription on her gravestone was clearer than it is now, it used to contain the terrible pronouncement on the death of her husband Charles, lost at sea in the year 1829. And that is followed up by the sentence, the earth and the sea shall give up their dead. So accordingly, I've searched for some indication of whether the sea would indeed give up the facts of how Captain Sandgren lost his life. And the historical record's been a bit grudging with that information. But we know a bit about how Sandgren lived through a first-person story about sailing on his vessel, the Mary Beckett. And the story was written by John A. Dahlgren, and it was published under the title The Fragment in the Saturday Evening Post of November 12, 1825. Dahlgren's father, Bernard, who was the Swedish consul in Philadelphia, was a congregant here at Gloria Day and was buried in the churchyard, although his body was later moved. And Sandgren was probably a friend of him, the elder Dahlgren, and had known young John from childhood. Both Sandgren and Bernard Dahlgren were born in Sweden. So soon after his father's death in 1824, 15-year-old John Dahlgren, now an orphan, opted for a life at sea. And indeed, he later became famous as a U.S. Navy admiral and inventor of a specialized gun. Young Dahlgren wrote in his journal, quote, "In order to obtain a knowledge of my intended profession, on the 30th of March, 1825, I embarked before the mast on board the brig Mary Beckett, owned by Lyle and Newman and commanded by Charles Sandgren, bound for Trinidad de Cuba. On the 2nd of April, experienced a very severe gale from the northeast, in which several vessels were lost. The 23rd May, he continued, we again set sail for Philadelphia. On the evening of the 29th May, the most severe gale that had ever visited the coast of the United States commenced, It lasted until the 4th of June. 24 hours more and our fate had been sealed. We were doubling the northwest head of Cuba when it commenced. Not being able to carry any sail, we were drifted by the current on the western coast of Florida, a lee shore. It was that eventful time that suggested the fragment. This is in his journal, and he's writing about why or how he wrote his story, the fragment. After he had returned from his voyage to Philadelphia, young Dahlgren was taken in and employed as a helper by Dr. Colleen, the pastor of Gloria Day Church. And he spent many hours with the old man in the former rectory. That's just a few years before the current rectory was built, right in this direction, right over here. And to while away the hours, Dahlgren again described his sea journey in the article that he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. Quote, "Too much agitated to retire to my berth, I threw myself on the cabin floor and soon fell asleep, dreaming of the various hardships to which we had been and still are exposed, of our dreadful prospects. I already fancied I felt the shock of the vessel striking and the cries of the sailors. The shrill whistle of the bosun rang in my ears. I started from my bed and fancied it a dream, but the hoarse cry of 'All hands ahoy!' convinced me that it was a dreadful reality. I was on deck in a minute. The vessel was laying to, under a close-reefed main topsail, and so strong was the gale that it alone was sufficient to heave her on her side. The bleached strip of canvas on the mizzen that was exposed to the wind was just discernible by the steady but feeble light from the battle lanterns on the quarterdeck, and the proud bunting at our peak was fluttering madly amidst the blasts. The commander was standing near the wheel with a desperate calmness stamped on his features, and with keen interest watching every plunge she made, and then gave his orders to the helmsman in a low, distinct voice to ease her with the helm. So this wise and calming commander in Dahlgren's story, Charles Sandgren, was about 48 or 49 years old in 1829 when he mysteriously disappeared at sea. He'd been carrying sugar and fruits from Trinidad, an old Spanish colonial town on the south coast of Cuba, to Philadelphia for almost 20 years, and he knew the waters very well. And we know from newspapers of the era that Charles Sandgren spent Christmas Day 1828 here in Philadelphia with his family, and the next day, December 28th, left on the Mary Beckett for his usual run to Trinidad de Cuba. And there are reports from other sea captains that they saw Sandgren unloading his cargo in Cuba in early February 1829. And another captain reported to the newspapers that he had left Trinidad on February 28th in tandem together with the Mary Beckett, but he lost sight of the other brig in the vicinity of Cape Corrientes in the far southwest corner of Cuba. And that is the last mention that I can find of Sandgren and the Mary Beckett. In looking at the ship manifests at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, neither the Mary Beckett nor her captain ever appear again. But one of the seamen on board the Mary Beckett does appear in the port of Philadelphia in a later voyage, and that was one of Charles Shanklin's brothers, Robert who shipped out on another vessel later in March 1829. And another brother, Benjamin Shanklin, the first mate on the Mary Beckett, doesn't appear on any ship manifests, but we know that he survived because he continues to be listed in street directories at his home here on Christian Street. So, and in fact, all the Shanklin brothers, as the city death records indicate, all of them lived well into old age. So what happened to the Mary Beckett and her captain? There are no reports of severe storms around Cuba at the time that the Mary Beckett was lost. However, there definitely was a strong resurgence of pirate activity in early 1829, spurred on by the fact that during the previous year, the U.S. Navy had stopped patrolling the area against pirates. And a number of American ships reported sighting pirates or being boarded by pirate ships at just about the time that Sandgren and the Mary Beckett were making their way home from Cuba. Some of these acts that they reported of the pirates seem to have been taken out of sheer villainy. A French warship came into Havana harbor on March 29th, for example, with a report of having found the brig Charlotte from Portland, Maine, with the crew members nailed to the deck, all dead, though the cargo was still intact. And around the same time, a Spanish government schooner arrived in Havana with a pirate schooner that she had captured in battle. And one of the persons who had been captured said that he had been forced to join the pirates after the rest of the crew had been murdered. And during his cruise, the man said some 115 people had been killed by the pirates. Another well-publicized act of piracy took place just a couple of weeks later to the Boston brig Attentive, which had sailed from Matanzas, Cuba, on February the 22nd, 1829. About 8 hours after sailing, she was taken by a pirate schooner, and the entire crew was murdered, except the second mate, Alfred Hill, who had concealed himself in the hold. And Hill reported later that after capturing the crew, the pirates called them up on the deck, one by one. And from his hiding place, he distinctly overheard the captain say, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." And then he heard a scuffling on the deck and groans of pain. And after the noise had ceased, the pirates searched throughout the vessel, he supposed for money. And around 4 p.m, they knocked out the porthole in the bow of the vessel, which allowed it to fill up with water, and then they left. So Hill remained hidden, he said, until twilight. And then he crept out onto the deck, and he saw that the pirates had fled. And he was able to fill the topsails to try to get the Attentive back into the harbor. But by that time, she had drawn too much water, and she sunk while she was still 3 miles from shore. And he managed to grab a plank and to paddle towards the land, landing on the beach about 4 a.m. on the following morning, and soon made his way to a house and to safety. And so, with dozens of pirate attacks taking place at the very time and place where the Mary Beckett was sailing, there's a fair chance that Captain Sandgren was killed in a battle with pirates. But it's still questionable why the Sandgren brothers survived and the captain didn't. So here too, it'll take more investigation to ascertain the truth. Pirates during this period, as in our own, were often considered in the public eye as romantic heroes. And they were living the kind of free and adventurous life that others could never experience. John Fanning Watson, in his Annals of Philadelphia History, written in the 1820s with subsequent editions up till 1844, wrote about the driving interest of many Philadelphia residents to find buried treasure, supposedly left by the pirates of more ancient times. And in Watson's day, parties roamed the areas along the Delaware with spades and shovels, trying to find the chests of gold allegedly left by Captain Kidd and Blackbeard and other buccaneers. Watson wrote in the 1844 edition, for example, "I heard that about 45 years ago, at the sign of the Cock in Spruce Street, there was found in a pot in the cellar a sum of money of about $5,000. In 1837, these romantic preoccupations with the buccaneers had an influence on public opinion when word came to Philadelphia that the Susquehanna, a packet ship to Liverpool, had been hijacked by pirates right off the capes of the Delaware. Now, the Susquehanna was the luxury lighters like the QE2 of its day, with many Philadelphians on board and 100 more people in steerage. And the company that booked her promised that she would leave port promptly on the 20th of every month for Liverpool. And moreover, the ship was towed down the Delaware by steamship, which enabled her to reach the open sea on the same day that she left the port. On October the 20th, 1837, after the pilot boat had left the Susquehanna at the mouth of Delaware Bay, the pilot looked back and managed to observe the ship approached by a low-slung schooner painted all black and bristling with men. And he watched the schooner come abreast of the Susquehanna, and men seemed to be boarding her. So the pilots returned to dock, and their news soon spread throughout Philadelphia and up and down the East Coast about the Susquehanna piracy. And ships were quickly launched from Philadelphia and also from New York, from the Chesapeake, and elsewhere to search for the marauders, fearing that they had kidnapped some of the notable passengers on board and stolen the gold that was rumored to have been on the Susquehanna. Even the U.S. Navy joined the search. And newspapers in Philadelphia and around the country ran the headline, "Audacious Piracy," and for the next month featured articles, one after the other, on the affair. Rumors flew, and the rumors were the meat of many of the articles. Some people recalled seeing Jean Lafitte, or his former confederate, the notorious one-eyed pirate and killer William Mitchell, on the streets of Philadelphia, and he seemed to be fitting out a black-colored schooner. And that rumor turned out to be largely true. However, Mitchell had been in prison in Philadelphia on charges of one of his wives of bigamy, and he was not released until June the 23rd, 1837, which was a month after the reported attack on the Susquehanna. 2 days after the attack, a columnist named Junius wrote the following in the National Gazette: "The bold and audacious capture of this noble packet, almost within sight of our very doors, has thrown the community into a state of excitement not to be conceived by those at a distance. I ask the American people, I ask our distressed and sympathizing community to hear me when I assert, and I hope to prove to them, that this distressing event is owing to the negligence and inefficiency of one of the President's cabinet, the Secretary of the Navy. It wasn't long, however, when a couple of vessels arrived in U.S. ports that reported having sighted the Susquehanna at sea. And they reported that all seemed well with this famous ship. And even then, many refused to believe that the report of the pirate attack had been bogus. And the news came from Maryland that people had sighted the timbers of a ship washed up on the beach, and have suggested that perhaps this was the remains of the doomed Susquehanna. But nevertheless, reports came back to Philadelphia that the Susquehanna had docked in Liverpool, right on schedule, and all the passengers were safe and oblivious to the panic that had arisen on their behalf back in the States. And a month later, the Susquehanna itself returned to its home port, and the story came out then about what had happened in October. The black schooner, the captain related, had belonged to fishermen who were selling fresh-caught shellfish, and the steward had loaded crates of these delicacies on board in order to stock up his larder for the voyage. A columnist for one of the Philadelphia newspapers summed up the affair by remarking, perhaps a bit remorsefully, that the days of Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, and other swashbucklers who a century earlier were common sight right in Delaware Bay were long gone. So, we have reached the end of the voyage. And the stories I related represent just a tiny cross-section of the information concerning the seagoing men and their families who were associated with this church or who lived in the neighborhood. I think we're lucky to live here in Philadelphia, where there's such so much rich historical material which is ripe for further discovery. So I thank you, and I hope that people will stay around. And in just a minute, we'll have a question and answer period. Thanks.
So I just want to take a few minutes to give you an update on our painting and repair project for the Keystone Grant. All of the interior walls have been painted. These are colors that were chosen in the 1800s and are correct. We have a memorial plaque here to a Colonel John Hanson, which we've discovered has a lot of mistakes in this. So we'll be providing more information and some interpretive stories over what's wrong and what's right about these plaques. But they are lovely examples, and they're about 80 years old. As we head back here, these walls were all very blistered from water damage. Now they've all been repaired and smoothed out. The cause of the water damage has been repaired. Our windows have all been, the windows glazed. There's still some cleanup to be done here, but they're cleaned up, they're secure. And then one of the most greatest, the transformations over here, was this wall in the back next to this poet plaque that honors the seamen that were lost in sea in 1980. This wall was terribly blistered from water damage, and you can see it's all perfectly smooth now and repainted. So we're nearing completion on our Keystone Grant project, and we expect that we will be done in about a month, depending on the weather, because our contractors from Materials Conservation are back outside. And then it will be time to raise money for the roof. So again, please do hit that donate button. This is an important building, an important part of American history, and we'd love you to be a part of it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to start by going through a couple of questions from our last webinar that we didn't have a chance to answer. These questions were from part one of this talk, and part one was about Philadelphia's early maritime history. So we thought we would answer some of those. And then in the meantime, you can type your questions into the question and answer window. So I should also tell you that a month ago, we had another program, which was just an Ask Us Anything. We had a panel, Michael and myself were included, and we actually did answer a couple of those questions, but we have a little more to say because we've done some more research. So Michael, one of the questions, one of the stories that you told in the last webinar had to do with women who went to sea disguised as men and were eventually caught. But you'd explained a little bit about how this wasn't necessarily a common occurrence, and perhaps that's the reason why when we hear these stories, they're so celebrated today. But there are a couple of other things that you wanted to add to that.
I did, thank you. I just wanted to make clear, though I don't think I'm mentioning anything that people in the audience, that any of us don't know, but I have to mention it as an adjunct to my own presentation. And that is that it was the social conventions, obviously, that kept women from going to sea and from many other trades. It wasn't any lack of ability because, after all, you had boys up there in the topsails and on the yardarms and so on, and women could do the work. But it was simply that, as in our own times, but even more obviously in the 19th century, women were expected to remain at home and take care of the family, or wealthier women perhaps to be more of a solely decorative nature. And the men could gallivant around the world as sailors do and earn the living. And women, if they were in trades, were basically trades that were somewhat related, for the most part, to domestic work, like we would see women here in Philadelphia in the era in roles as seamstresses or dispensing food and drink, tavern owners and barmaids, and that sort of thing. And part of the, how would you say it, the subjugation of women, as I see it, had to do with the costume, because after all, the story I told, I think her name was Emma Barnes, a woman who had to dress like a man in order to go to sea. And then she was caught and she was put on trial in Philadelphia. And the trial was not for the fact that she went to sea, it was that she was caught dressing like a man. She wore trousers, and so she was, whatever it was, given a fine or went to jail or something for that. So if I didn't mention that, I don't remember to what degree I did, but I think I too would be guilty of just telling a somewhat humorous story and then being part of that prejudice. So I wanted to mention that.
Well, great. Well, thank you. We have a couple other questions that I'd like to go over. Do any remnants of old ports or communities exist today which can be visited? And this is marked or unmarked.
I guess the questioner means in our area. I don't know of any intact port towns along the Delaware or in Egg Harbor and areas that were ports along the Atlantic coast. But I think probably the main area that one can view that's somewhat intact is our own neighborhood, Queen Village, right here, where you can see whole streets like I think in the talk we mentioned Kenilworth Street, which used to have a number of sea captains living along those. Those are larger houses, and many of those houses go back even to the early 18th century. It was settled in, it was built up starting in 1739. And there are other streets like that. Front Street used to be known as kind of a captain's row. And there are stories of captains who would then be able to look out over the sea and see the ships coming in and so forth. And also you can see the remnants from a later time of the finger piers along the Delaware, along the pathway, the bicycle path that goes along the riverside. So there you can see some of it right here at home.
I think you can also, this isn't exactly the same thing, but you can also now visit the completely refinished Washington Avenue Pier, which was the location of the immigration station. And that has been renovated and turned into a park with natural landscaping, and plus a really nifty sculpture where you can climb up and get a beautiful view of the river. So I guess that would give you some sense. But there are also, like you mentioned, a number of the remnants of these finger piers, which are still visible. As a matter of fact, that condominium building that's near the Mosholu, I think to the left of that, you can see the remnants of a pier that collapsed in the 1990s. I think it was a nightclub or something, and this was a big story in the news. You remember that? Yeah, but that was an old pier that they had taken, and somebody opened a nightclub, and they probably didn't get proper permits for what they were doing because it wasn't structurally sound, and it was a big disaster. So that's still there.
I love to go to the Pier 53. I was there just a couple of days ago when the weather turned nice, and remarked to myself that you can still see the concrete bulwarks of the old pier there, and one can try to imagine that this being the immigration point, for thousands and thousands of immigrants coming in at this very spot, and railroad trains, coming up to the door. And also that was where soldiers came down the Delaware from places like New York City during the Civil War. And then they would take the train along Washington Avenue to the train terminal there at Broad and Washington, and go on to the southern front of the war. And just imagine people, thousands of people, the way it used to be, and now it's given over to nature.
Thousands of people just steps from Gloria Day Church, right? I mean, we're talking half a block from where the church is. So thousands of people coming in, and some of them presumably becoming part of the what we call Queen Village today, and certainly part of Gloria Day Church. So we've got a question from the audience, and this has to do with the story you told about Last Island. Were there any insurance records regarding the loss of the slaves and other property on the barrier island off New Orleans?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer. I don't know. But it suggests a direction to go for further research. So I thank the questioner for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's another, this is kind of a three-part question. I live in a house that was built in 1785 on a street that research shows was dubbed Captain's Row in Old City. Now, the person who submitted this question lives on the 300 block of North Lawrence Street. So do you want to talk about where captains tended to live, and particularly you and I looked at the architecture of this block, and we did a little bit of research on the people who lived there at some time. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's very interesting, and we corresponded with, since we had some time, with the questioner there. North Lawrence Street is a block of largely 18th century, very early 19th century buildings that remains from a large neighborhood that the city rather wantonly tore down, partially for the extension of the Vine Street Expressway, and partially to create a industrial district. The houses on that side of the street, I think, were of great interest to us because they are contiguous row houses. And as far as I can see, was able to find, they might very well be the oldest extant row houses in the city.
Okay, we should define for everybody what you mean by row house. Because
I mean,
yeah.
right, houses, a series of houses that are built as a unit at the same time, and they share a wall, or they have,
A party
walls,
wall.
right? Yeah, a party wall. That's right.
So the reason why this is important, just for people who are unaware, you typically get in Society Hill and Queen Village, you get houses that were built as one. Sometimes you get twins, like my house is a twin. It was built the same time, and I share floor joists with the house next to me. And you get twins, sometimes you get triplets, but it's pretty rare, especially in 1785, to have, what is it, something like 8 houses that on that block that were all built together. So it's early develop. It's very like early mass development, I guess, is a way to put it.
Right. Amongst finer houses, often the development that gets the most credit is on the north side of Walnut Street, opposite Washington Square, built by William Sampson, who also built Sampson Street at the same time in 1799 and 1800. But this was before 1799. And in looking at directories and so forth, I wasn't able to pinpoint it at 1785, but at least by 1790, those houses were there and lived in. So as far as it being Captain's Row there, Amy, we could find no information on that. It was probably, I would think, unlikely that it would be Captain's Row because it wasn't right along the waterfront, and also the houses were more of tradesmen and not of sea captains who, like along Front Street, have much grander houses. And all the names that we could find in the directories, there's one from 1785. I guess this doesn't appear in that, but the 1791 or 1791 directory, they're all trades people, weavers and potterers and that kind of thing in those houses.
Yeah. So I mean, as you were saying, sea captains tended to live closer to the water. That's a little far. That'd be pretty much a hike in 1785 to go from there to the waterfront. So here's the second part of the question. All of our row homes have arches in the basements through which it is thought that food was taken from house to house for the sailors who boarded here while their ships were being unloaded and waiting for a new voyage to begin. So I can answer part of this question. This book, Philadelphia Preserved, by Richard Webster, which is a catalog of the Historic American Building Survey, this is a very good read if you're interested in learning about a little bit about the architecture and then sort of getting a catalog of all of the buildings that have been cataloged as part of this project. And what he describes, and this is particular, by the way, to the section on South Philadelphia, even though the person we're talking about lives on North Orange Street. Equally characteristic of colonial Philadelphia houses include the vaulted alleyway that is supported on brick arches in the cellar and cuts through at the street level to the backyard. So those arches actually support the alleyway that appears between usually two houses that were built at the same time. I have these arches in my basement, and I have a shared alleyway with my next door neighbor. And what I can tell you about when I look at the insurance surveys for our two houses, fire insurance surveys for our two houses, and Michael, you've done this with your house as well. When these houses were built together, one of those archways was indeed open so that you can pass through in the basements of these houses. So now mine is closed up. Somebody did it long before I moved in. But they're really meant to support having that open alley, which is a real boon if you live in a house like ours, because it means you can get to the front to the back, you can take out the garbage easily, and all that good stuff. So did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, that's
Okay. And then here's the part 3 of the same question. Can you shed any light into the lives of mariners who made the sea their career and what they might have done while they waited between voyages?
well. Mariners sometimes would take odd jobs, various jobs of that type. If it's between voyages, obviously it couldn't be anything that was particularly permanent. I remember one person whom we researched, who I believe is on the website of Historic Gloria Day, was a man named Henry Bennett. And he was a mariner, but between ships, he worked in an ice cream parlor right on the corner of 3rd and Queen Street, where the Italian restaurant is now. And in fact, he died of a heart attack while he was working in the ice cream parlor. So there's an example, and I'm sure there are many others of that type.
Oh, one of the other things that you and I have learned in doing research, particularly into the sea captains and mariners who are buried at Gloria Day, is they don't tend to stay at sea all that long. I think we found on average that for some of them it was 7 years at most. And they some of them wind up coming back to land and opening businesses that are related to maritime trade sometimes, whether we've got, George Ord, who's buried right next to the front doors of the church. He opened a rope making business to support ships. I can't come up with any other examples right now, but you get people doing or becoming merchants. Oh yeah. William Spafford, whose house still stands. He was a sea captain. His house still stands at the corner of Front and Bainbridge Streets. He wound up becoming a merchant I think his store was on Market Street. So we get people who wind up sometimes with trades that are, they've established connections, I guess, being at sea, and then they wind up in doing things like that. So I don't know if that's helpful. But
Yeah,
that's
Spafford was similar to the Ord that you mentioned. He was a chandler, and he had a rope making works over at where Passyunk hits Fifth Street, about where the Rite Aid is.
yeah, and he also had a store on Market Street too, I think.
Yes, at an earlier point he did.
Yeah, he was a merchant. Okay, so another question was from this again. This is from the first talk. did Philadelphia ever have a fishing industry?
Well, we've all heard of Fishtown nowadays, I think, and I think that harkens back supposedly to the fishing industry that indeed Philadelphia used to have. The major food fish in the river, of course, was shad, and it was both the Schuylkill and the Delaware had legions of shad. They said at one point you could walk across the Delaware River on the backs of the shad. They were so plentiful. But there are stories there of native women, you know, in those times being able to walk into the Schuylkill, let's say, and and harvest the shad by hand. And the industry, as I remember, was almost wiped out several times. It was overfished, and also when they built dams and some of the tributaries, that also disturbed the spawning grounds and so forth. In the 1890s, I guess it was, they restocked it, but then soon afterwards, as the port continued to grow, and during the First World War, all the poisons that they spewed into the river killed the shad once again. And now, evidently, it's starting to come back, as all fish are. But coincidentally, just today, I was reading this article about, I guess it's in the Inquirer, I think, about the oxygen levels declining somewhat in the Delaware, in the area of Philadelphia, between Philadelphia and Wilmington, and recommending amelioration of that. The problem being particularly Philadelphia's waste facilities. They don't presently filter out enough of the ammonia from human waste, and so that's something that they have to work on, or else there will be another massive fish kill.
I read in the paper, again, the paper, see, you and I are big readers. I read, I think this was in the Inquirer as well, that near Bartram's Garden, there's going to be an effort to reintroduce shellfish into the river, because shellfish, like mussels and oysters, they clean the water, right? So hopefully efforts like that will help these different populations thrive again. So we'll see. Stay tuned for that. This is another question, again, from the first talk. You mentioned it would take 4 days to a week for a ship to navigate the Delaware River and Bay to depart to the sea from Philadelphia. Why would it take so long to go such a short distance?
In the days of the sailing ships, the problem was mainly the vicissitudes of the wind. You know, if you had a good wind behind you, then you could gain a few days. But if the wind was stalled, then it would be very difficult. Or if it was blowing against you, but there were many other contributing reasons. Storms or ice, obviously in winter, sometimes closing the port entirely for months on end. And I would think shoals were always a problem. And in times of drought, I would imagine that they would become more prominent as well. But that's the thing. I spoke in this talk about the Susquehanna, and the Susquehanna was kind of, I guess we'd call it today, a hybrid, wouldn't we? Because it had sails, and it also had paddle wheels on the side. We showed a photograph of the the Susquehanna during the talk, but those engines were not as efficient, obviously, as modern ones. So it would take longer. It would take, like to cross the Atlantic, for example, the time steadily went down to make a crossing. In the 1830s, it would take 2 weeks or more to cross the Atlantic, and then in the 1880s, it got into the early 20th century. It would take about a week or so, and then in the 1950s, the great ocean liners, the last, like the SS United States that we have docked here in Philadelphia, and that could do it in about 4 or 5 days.
Yeah. So one of the audience members has commented, also the sandbars in the Delaware and the Bay, they're the main reason that Henry Hudson's Captain May declined going up the Delaware. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. Here's another question. Can you describe the hierarchy on a ship and what the various responsibilities were? So I think this has to do with the difference between, a captain and a bosun and an able-bodied seaman.
Mm-hmm. Well, starting at the top, amongst the officers, you have the captain or the master, who's in charge of just about everything. Frequently, that's the owner in the 19th century. Then you have the first mate. Usually there's 3 mates, so you have the first mate. Now, when I sailed, our first mate, as I remember, was in charge of the bridge, the navigation, and that sort of thing. And the second mate was in charge of the deck. So I was a deck boy, so the orders for, anchor and, and anything, loading the cargo and so on was his responsibility. But on some ships, it's reversed. The second mate is up in the bridge and so on. And then with us, the third mate was in charge of the engine room. But on a sailing ship, I think the third mate was just sort of like an auxiliary and did a little, helped in everything else. And then going down, you had the bosun. So the bosun was the one who transmitted the orders to the men on deck. He was sort of like the sergeant, taking the orders from the officers. And then you had ABs, able-bodied seamen, who would often, they were highly skilled, experienced seamen. When I shipped out, they even had to show proficiency and take an exam and so on. And they would like lead the work crews. And then you had ordinary seamen. And then you had like boys below that who would do a lot of the work up in the sails and so on, because they were little guys. And in the correspondingly, you had a steward. I think in military ships, he might be the same one, who's called the purser, who's in charge of the stores, the dispersing goods or even pay to the men. He's in charge of the kitchen area and that sort of thing. And below him is the cook.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering that. Just to give a plug for some other things that we're doing, currently inside the church in the sacristy, we have an exhibit dedicated to the lost seamen of the SS Poet, which went missing in 1980. And it's quite a mysterious story with a lot of theories about what happened to it. But part of the exhibit is we have photos of the entire crew, I think with the exception of 2 men. And so a photo of the person, where they were from, how old they were when they went missing, and what their role was on the poet. So if that's of interest to you, please visit us. The church, I don't know what the church hours are currently, but we'll be hopefully open again completely soon. So I think that's the last, that was the last of the questions. Michael, thank you so much for giving the talk and answering questions this evening. And thank you all for attending this program. If you enjoyed this, despite the technical glitches at the beginning, if you just enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to our organization on our website, which is preserveoldswedes.org. Your donor dollars go toward the preservation and restoration of this very important historic treasure in Philadelphia. So thank you all so much, and we'll hope to see you at a future program. Good night.
Good night.